I'm John Gavin from Remarkable NRM. Remarkable NRM is a huge company based all over Australia. We deal with 80% of Australia that is just the rangelands, and it's basically me. But today I also have my wife Louise here, who's given me a bit of a hand, so if you've got any questions or want any contact details, Louise is there also. My background is in natural resource management. I'm not a carbon broker. I have no commercial interests in any carbon projects, so hopefully that means you feel a little bit more relaxed about some of the things I'm going to tell you. So I've been working in the rangelands for I don't know how long anymore. Used to be up in Alice Springs for a while, and I'm actually based in South Australia, so I've been working with the pastoral industry over there for feral animal control. Weed management was my background, but then all sorts of stuff around water management, soil erosion, veg management. There's an expectation on us to manage the environment. The carbon market was a way for us to actually get paid for that management that the expectation is there for. So I thought it was a good way for the people that benefit from the management to actually pay for it. Now things have moved on a little bit from there. I was actually trying to kill camels when I came up with that idea, and it was a major flop, but I'm almost over it. So things have moved on, and we're here today to talk about how it's moved on and what it actually means for you guys. So today, Darren's asked me to cover everything, basically. So if I can do that in an hour and a half, we'll be doing well. We're going to start with a bit about climate change. We'll go into why we have carbon projects, what we're trying to achieve. We'll talk about the Emissions Reduction Fund, and obviously we'll just touch on the discussions that have just finalised in Paris and the relevance for you guys here. So starting with climate change, there's some real fundamentals that we need to cover off on. This lectern's really annoying. And I'll cover off the fundamentals. It's going to be a bit random, but it will all come together at the end, I promise. And it'll all come together later on today when you're trying to make the decisions about whether this is an industry you want to get involved in. What we've got are greenhouse gases. That's what this is all about. Now, we all talk about carbon, but we're talking about a range of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the main one, and we can see here there's a thing called a 100-year global warming potential. Now, these are determined by the International Panel on Climate Change. They use a whole heap of science, and they revise them from time to time. So the figures we have here are based on a thing called Assessment Report 4. Now these figures are important because what they do is, for you, they tell you eventually how many Australian carbon credit units you'll generate, because not all greenhouse gases are the same. So some greenhouse gases have a bigger impact in the atmosphere, so therefore they're more important to us, they're worth more if you're trying to produce a carbon product. So carbon dioxide is the standard. I'm going to pinch a texter. Carbon dioxide is a standard, so we come back to a standard of 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. Everything comes back to that. That's the main thing you've got to remember. So 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equals 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. Methane has 25 times the global warming potential, has 25 times the impact in the atmosphere. And that could be because of the impact it has or the time it actually persists in the atmosphere in areas. But methane is 25 times the global warming potential. So if you can stop methane entering the atmosphere, 1 tonne of methane equals 25 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Methane's really important to us because of livestock and manure. So it's really important in the land sector. The next one's nitrous oxide. You can see 298 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. So if you can stop 1 tonne of nitrous oxide entering the atmosphere, you get 298 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Good ways for that, urea in livestock or fertiliser change. You've then got some industrial gases. You can see that they're massively huge. There aren't too many agriculturalists that will be producing sulphur hexafluoride. You really need to be concentrating on methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So they're going to be the important base level gases that you got, greenhouse gases that you guys can actually work with to generate a carbon credit. Carbon cycle, just about everyone in the room would have seen a carbon cycle at some stage. I think they cover it in primary school. You may not remember it. The key to the carbon cycle as it relates to us are these bits around agriculture and these bits about human-induced. Does that mean I'm out of time already?
No, it means I stuffed up.
Can you do that at the 1 hour mark, please? So you can see there's some figures here around the size, and this is gigatons. So you can see the size of the carbon store in the atmosphere, 750 gigatons. You can see vegetation, 610. The ocean is massive. There's a hell of a lot of carbon stored in the ocean. And you can see that what we're producing here through industrial gases is actually not that great, but it's not so much the quantum, it's the change, the change and the impact it has in the atmosphere. And the vegetation, so the ones over here, these numbers here are actually how much is moving between the states. So as you'd know, that anything that's in the sediments, it's actually pretty secure. It doesn't move very much at all. It takes a volcanic eruption for that to happen. Deep ocean's another good spot for it. So every time you get wind erosion and it goes across and lands in the Pacific somewhere and sinks down, you're doing a great thing for the atmosphere. Not so good for your business, but you know. But we can see these flux numbers here, the changes here. And it's the things that are happening on the surface that give us the opportunity as pastoralists to actually do something. So what we can do is change livestock management, we can change farming systems, we can sequester carbon into trees and the soil. We're not going to be able to do much around here, but we don't need to worry about that. We're just looking at the bit that humans have influenced. That's the important part of what we're trying to achieve. And this is why these are fairly standard sort of figures and graphs. They've worked some of this stuff out through doing things like ice cores in the Antarctic. They drill really deep cores and take the bubbles of gas out of the ice at the bottom, which is incredibly old. They can analyse that and tell us what the atmosphere looked like. So it's actual real direct measurement. But we can see that since the Industrial Revolution, the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have increased dramatically. Basically, in short, that's what this is all about. That's why we have the opportunity to generate a carbon credit. That's why we're having all these discussions internationally. It's all about trying to reduce the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And ultimately, we don't really care about the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it's just that they impact on us. And how they impact on us is important. So what we have at the moment is, with increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you have solar radiation coming in, and what happens as the sun shines, it hits cloud, hits the atmosphere and bounces back into space, or it makes it through more often than not in Charleville, heats up the earth, and then that energy is emitted back out. The heat of the earth goes back out, but it's a different wavelength. So solar radiation comes in, the heat goes out as infrared radiation. And it's a different wavelength. So it bounces off the atmosphere. Some of it goes straight back out if it hits it at the right angle, but some of it bounces off the atmosphere. And the more those gases build up in the atmosphere, the less of the infrared heat can get out. And that's why they say it's like a blanket. It's not actually warming the earth by itself, it's actually just trapping the heat of the earth in. So if we can change the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we can alter the temperature of the earth. And we've proven that we can do that. Again, direct measurement. This is a fairly standard graph showing global temperatures. So they take the temperatures across the Earth's surface and they give us a global average. The line in the middle is that average from 1910 to now. And then the blue shows the years where the global temperature has been below average, and the red shows the years where the global temperature has been above average. So average global temperature, you can see that since 1980 we haven't had a year where our average global temperature has been below average. And in fact, I think the last 13 years have had the last 10 years, the hottest 10 years on record internationally. So this is as a direct result of that increase in greenhouse gas. They used to use all sorts of varying phrases about, oh, we're not really sure about this, or we're slightly confident, and all the rest of it. So now you've got scientists, international agreement saying, no, we're certain about this. This is happening, and we're actually starting to see the effects of it. And it's the same for Australia. So similar sort of data for Australia, but this little bit messier. The blue line is showing the temperature in our surrounding oceans. The red line is our land-based temperature. The one in the middle is showing our average. And you can see since about 1980 we haven't been below average. The dark red line is our average moving trend. But the important thing is you can still see there's massive variation. So this is the average here, but you can see we had years here where it was considerably cooler than average. But the average comes through. And because we're talking about climate rather than weather, it's the overall picture that we're interested in. Weather is that daily stuff that we go out and look at and decide what we're going to do for the day. Climate is our long-term system. That's why it always comes back to averages. This is the global, this is the heating. So climate change has a number of impacts on us. Some of those are temperature related, and that's the thing that we hear most commonly. Some of them are rainfall related. We don't hear much talk about rainfall because it's really uncertain about how that's going to occur across the country. There's no real, there's a number of predictions and a number of models that tell us what's happening, but because of all your local effects about landform and wind systems and a whole range of factors, what's happening with rainfall is nowhere near as straightforward as what's happening with temperature. But it also impacts for landholders, it impacts in increased rates of evaporation and actually changes in the season. So summer might start earlier and go a little bit longer, your winter might be shorter, your rainfall, you might have the same amount but it's coming in sharper, larger bursts, or it's coming in a different season. So you might have a bigger issue with summer weeds or winter weeds, so it's going to impact on your production system in the shifts in the season, not just the amounts. But this one's just talking about temperature, and so this is talking about the change in average temperature across Australia since 1910. You can see it's not the same everywhere. We've got some areas where we've only had 0 to half a degree increase. The darker areas, you're up to about a 1.5% degree change, but the average around Australia comes out at about 0.9 degrees. That's what we've had to date. So our average surface temperature in Australia has increased 0.9 degrees to date. And so everyone talks about 2 degrees as being a target. If we go above 2 degrees, we've got what they call catastrophic climate change. Things will change dramatically. And we're halfway there, basically. So what the Australian government has done in the system that they've created has given landholders the opportunity to generate a carbon credit, which will hopefully benefit landholders. It'll hopefully prevent us from actually reaching that 2 degree target. That's averages. That's talking about the standard sort of change that we might see. The critical thing for management is about what's going to happen at the extreme ends. So we have what's called a standard distribution curve. If you take any standard population, any statistical model, you'll have this standard distribution curve where 80% of what happens is in the middle, and you'll have the extreme events either one way or the other way. Now, what happens when you get a slight shift in that curve, so you can see a slight shift here, the size at the extreme ends changes dramatically. So if you look at the standard curve and you look at how many days we're going to have as less cold, like it's going to be cold weather, and you shift that curve a little bit to the right, so we've just warmed things up just a fraction, you'll see the area under the curve, the amount of cold weather we're going to have, decreases dramatically. And the same at the other end. If you look at your standard curve and you look at the area of hot days, it starts off moderate, we can handle that, we're used to that, particularly around here. But with that slight shift in the curve, the area increases dramatically. So it's at those extreme ends that we're going to see big shifts. So it's extreme rainfall events, it's extreme storm events, it's the hotter days. This is borne out by the data so far. So this graph talks about the number of days where our temperature, Australia's national temperature, is in the top 1% of temperatures. So, sorry, I keep cutting you guys off. So you can see that over time, you know, back in the late 19 teens, so 1916 through to 1920, we didn't have any days where the temperature was in the top 1% of temperatures for that time of year. But you can see here now we've got 26, 27 days where we're in the top 1%. So that's those extremes, that's at the end. And it's the same now, so 2015, they haven't finished the data yet. It's going to come out as the world's hottest year again. 2014, I think, was the same for Australia. I don't know how we're tracking for Australia. If it's our hottest year on record again, it's going to mean that our 10 hottest years have been in the last 12 years or something. So you can see the number of extremely hot days are increasing. It's those extreme events. Becomes particularly relevant when we're talking about carbon. Most of the carbon projects in southwest Queensland at the moment, or in the rangelands across the country at the moment, are about vegetation. And one of the beautiful things about vegetation when it gets dry and hot is it burns. And burning solves a lot of problems. We've been talking about what you do with a dysfunctional hotel business or something like that over the last couple of days. It can solve a lot of problems, but for carbon it can also create them. And this little diagram here shows the increase in fire frequency, fire danger index. So the bigger the circle, the bigger the change, the increase. Now this is a ripper. Luckily for Australia, the majority change is down in the southeast corner, so it's about time they got some of their own back. But if you're in the rangelands, you can see there's some significant change here. Charleville and Western Queensland has a bit of a mixed model going on, and that's a little bit to do with the changes in the timing of your rainfall. But it's something to think about if you're, for instance, planning an agricultural project that's going to be around for 100 years. You also need to think about what the climate is that you're going to be dealing with in 100 years' time. Or it's the same as if you're building infrastructure. So particularly from a local government point of view, if you go to the coast now and they're talking about building some sort of infrastructure, they'll look at it and say, well, how long, or they should, how long is this infrastructure going to last for? How long are we building this bridge for? So what's the climate going to be at the end of its lifetime? So if we're building a bridge, we're going to spend, well, in Adelaide they spent, I don't know, about $40 million on a footbridge so you could walk to the casino after the cricket. They need to look at that and plan, because they think that bridge is going to be there for 60 years. So what's the river flows going to be like in 60 years' time? What's the storm events going to be like? Do they need to plan for that? It's the same for agriculture. So if you're building a fence, fences, believe it or not, they're expensive, but they're relatively easy to move. So you might sit there and go, okay, I'm building this fence and I think I'm going to use it for 30 years. Well, you can think about, well, what's my property going to look like? What projects am I doing in 30 years? Will that fence fit it? But if you're building a shearing shed, or if you're investing in an abattoir, you're trying to vertically integrate and you've got way too much money, then you need to think about, well, what's the lifespan of that infrastructure and how's it going to impact? So even down to carbon projects, if you're thinking I'm going to do a carbon project and I need to maintain this for 25 or 100 years, you need to think about what sort of environment will I be maintaining that project in. And things like the impact of climate change on fire frequency are going to be critical. It's already critical in the higher populated areas where we might actually try and get out there and stop fires or losing lives and those sorts of things. We've had to actually change our fire system in Australia so that we can now take into account some of these more extreme days. But it's going to be really relevant for you guys as well. So that was climate change. That's all I know about climate change. Does anyone have any questions or comments about climate change? For you is about your management, but it's also really relevant because if you're going to get into a carbon market, that issue about climate change and what we're going to do about it is what drives the market. So if you're producing food or fibre, demand for that product drives the market. So people need to eat, most people buy meat to do that, so you need to produce meat. And that drives the price, availability and production systems. The impact of climate change on the earth and what we're going to try and do about it is what's going to drive the price for a carbon credit. And I'll explain that a little bit later on. So this is where Australia is at. This is what we're looking at. So this is what Australia's emissions look like, and it's broken down into sector. So this tall one here is electricity. You can see our electricity emissions have peaked some time ago. We had a beautiful thing called the global financial crisis. Did more for reducing greenhouse gas emissions than anything else has so far. But we've also had much more efficient appliances. We've had this perverse thing, particularly in the East Coast, where the price of electricity has got more and more expensive, and so people are actually using less of it. And so our emissions from electricity have decreased. We've become more efficient, we've become more aware, but it's also become more expensive, so we're using less of it. So our emissions are dropping, which is an awesome thing for just about everyone, unless you happen to own a power generator or the transmission lines. So you'll see that they're going to start doing all sorts of funny things to pricing electricity because they're starting to look a little bit worried about their business models. You've then got transport, emissions from transport. You can see a general increase, and emissions from stationary energy. These ones are a little bit more, you can see some blips where we've had financial drop-offs, but these ones are more tied to the production overall in Australia's economy. So you just see this gentle change. Industrial processes have risen, but they're dropping off. Agriculture's down here. Agriculture's been trending along fairly nicely, and so is waste management. So you can see the majority impact of our emissions. The majority of our emissions come from electricity production, and the majority of impact in changing those has actually come along most recently from reducing electricity use. But we've also had them in land sector changing. Western Queensland was actually a major part of that for Australia's national accounts. So when land clearing laws came in, that actually reduced Australia's emissions. You guys didn't get paid for it first time around, but you have the opportunity now. And this is why it matters. So Australia makes commitments. We're all part of a global system. The Australian government has made commitments to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We can see this as the nation's emissions tracking along quite nicely. We get to about 2005 here, we get a bit of a peak, which is important. But then we signed Kyoto, and we said we're going to come up with an emissions target of 108% of our 1990 level, and which would get us to about here. That's that dotted line there. We're tracking below that. I think we're at about 104% of our Kyoto target. So we're going to meet our Kyoto target. That job's done. And in fact, what happens is we've got extra credits. We've done better than our Kyoto target. We're then going to have a new target, and the target's important. Our current target is -5% by 2020. So you can see this green line. This green line is projections, projected emissions without, this is old data, but without a carbon price of some sort, without some approach. So this is referring to the old carbon farming initiative. The projections with the blue line, what our projected emissions were if we did something, had a carbon price or a carbon farming initiative, or now the emissions reduction fund. And so the gap between our -5% target and there tells us how much carbon we either need to take out of the atmosphere and store, or how many carbon dioxide equivalents we need to stop producing for us to reach our target. So that gap tells us the size of the market. It's like being told way out in advance how many cattle Australia needs to produce in 2020 to meet the market. We know what the government's going to be looking for to meet our targets. Now this data, everything in the climate world is old unless you did it this morning, in the carbon world, sorry. So this data is old. I should have started my disclaimer with, I am a consultant, so therefore don't trust me. If nothing I say is legal or financial advice. If we're at the pub having a beer, I will say it like I'm absolutely dead certain about it. But if I'm standing up here, I'm not certain about anything. You need to get your own advice. But what this shows us is the size of the market. How much demand is there going to be for this product that we call a carbon credit? So if Australia had stuck to its guns, I don't know, I haven't heard anything, maybe some people in the room know further. What Australia did is we said, look, we don't really believe in this, so we're going to go with a -5% target. That's not a real big stretch, but you know, it makes it look like we're doing something, so it's all pretty cruisy. But what we'll do is if the rest of the world does something, then we'll realise that we're pretty inadequate and we'll go to a -15% target, or we'll reconsider it. Now, the rest of the world is doing something, but I think the reconsideration has dropped off the table. I don't think there's any move for us to have a new target by 2020 at this stage. Who knows? Maybe our politicians will come home from Paris on a wave of camembert or something and be in a great mood and decide to do something. But what that means is if they do increase it, there is going to be a greater demand for carbon credits. We're going to have to do more to meet our target. And that's good news for people that are producing carbon credits, because that increases your market. And every time you've got an agricultural product, if the market gets bigger, you've got a better chance of making a quid. So that's simply why we have carbon projects. To reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we've got two choices. We can either stop producing greenhouse gases, or we can drag them out of the atmosphere and store them. And landholders are actually in the front row of being able to do those projects. You guys got an early mark, and so you're able to get off the blocks before everyone else, but everyone else is catching up. And that's because of this thing called the Emissions Reduction Fund, and this is the core to how you generate an income from all that stuff about climate change and carbon. Because I need you to think about carbon credits or storing carbon as just another agricultural product. It's the same as producing meat, it's the same as producing fibre. What you do is you go out there, you manage your stock, you manage your vegetation, you manage your property, you respond to climate, you respond to fire, soils, all these things that give you different capacity on your properties, and you generate a product. And that product is the carbon credit. So that stuff we've just talked about is why as a nation or as a planet we're doing anything about it, how that impacts on the size of the market. But now we start to get into the rules about how you actually do generate a credit. So if you think about it as just an agricultural product, you need to start thinking about how do I produce it, how do I sell it? And it's a new product. They've created this product overnight. And so the current policy of the Australian government for how you make money out of a carbon credit, and sorry, I should start, because I will forget. I try not to use acronyms too much, but I will forget. That's an ACU. We'll talk about ACUs, if I haven't already used that term. That's an Australian Carbon Credit Unit. That's all it is. 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent equals potentially 1 ACU. So if you can stop 100 tonnes of CO2 equivalents going into the atmosphere, then you could potentially generate 100 Australian carbon credit units. And it's not the gas that you sell, it's the credit unit. Now, no one's actually going to give you a credit. No one's going to send you 100 bits of paper in the mail, and we're talking about gases that you can't see or smell or anything like that. So you've got to picture these things like shares in a register. If you buy and sell shares, no one actually comes and says, look, here's your piece of BHP. You get a number, your name's beside it, it's stored somewhere, you have the right to trade it and stuff. It's the same with an ACU. It's a financial product. You can trade it, you can keep it, you can do all sorts of things. At the moment, we have a thing called the Emissions Reduction Fund, and that sets the rules for how we're going to be able to do this. And so the Emission Reduction Fund's different from previous arrangements. I don't know whether anyone here had the misfortune to hear me talk in about 2011 or 12 or something. Back then we were talking about the Carbon Farming Initiative, and we were talking about the tax, the carbon tax, the previous government's policy. It's changed to be the emissions reduction fund. Back then, it was only agriculture and landfill waste that could generate a carbon credit. So you really had a free kick. Not only did the government create a new product and create a new market, which was massive, they also limited the people that could actually produce the product. So it was the perfect economic condition for you. Here's something we have to have. It's going to be worth a lot of money, and you guys are the only ones that can make it. Sounds like a dream. Not everyone agreed with that, and so now it's open to all sectors of the economy. So it's not just agriculture that can create a carbon credit. It's not just landfill waste. It's now pretty much anyone. Industry, electricity generators, transport operators, a whole heap of people can now generate carbon credits. So the market has opened up. It's a very important point when you're talking about the finance of it. The government is quite clear, purely and simply about getting the lowest cost abatement. So under the old scheme, there were different mechanisms in place to make sure that we got good outcomes and all sorts of different things that they were chasing. This one is purely and simply the cheapest way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. There's no two ways about it. It doesn't matter if you've got, fantastic employment outcomes. It's going to keep central Queensland alive. It's going to save Charleville because of all these great social outcomes, and it's going to make a bit of carbon credits at the side. It doesn't matter. You've got to be able to produce this stuff. You've got to be able to produce it cheaply. And there's two things here. Because it is an agricultural product, it's the same as meat and all the rest of it. There's the cost of production, and so we know what you need to do to actually store carbon in the rangelands. We also know what you need to do to stop it from being emitted. And there's costs involved in that. But then there's the cost of production of the carbon credit. So you can actually store, for instance, soil carbon. You can actually store carbon in the soil, and it makes sense for a whole heap of agricultural reasons. But it might not make sense to then go through the cost of producing the carbon credit and selling it. That cost might be more than it's worth to you. The soil carbon's still definitely worth it to you. It's almost priceless. But the carbon credit unit has a cost attached to it as well. And it's the same with livestock. We all know that you can grow cows, and there are market conditions where you can't sell them at a profit. We all know that you can do that with sheep, that you can actually produce the product, no worries at all. We know what the cost is, but we're just not going to make enough money out of it to make it worthwhile. And that's an important consideration when you're talking about getting into a new market. So if you're looking at changing from, there's been a big shift from sheep to cattle. If you're looking at changing into that new market, you have to look at what the economics are, work out what it is that you can produce, how much it is going to cost you to produce it, and then how much you're going to be able to sell it for. Otherwise you don't know whether you're going to make a quid. Now I know there's a lot of people that don't do that up front. My family used to be one of them. But at the end of the day, that's ideally where we need to be in terms of primary production. So they just want to get the lowest cost abatement. They're not going to give you a free ride. You've got to be able to produce the stuff. You've got to be able to produce it economically, and you've got to be able to sell it. The best way to sell it is make it cheap. It's that simple. Now the emissions reduction fund is designed in three segments. There's the thing about crediting, purchasing and safeguarding. So crediting are the rules around how you can generate an Australian carbon credit unit, and we'll touch on that quite a bit today. Purchasing, we've got Paul and Mark from the Australian Government are going to talk about the auction, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And that's basically how someone buys that carbon credit unit, how the Australian Government will buy that carbon credit unit off you. And then there's safeguarding, which is a whole heap of different rules about how do we make sure that the good work that we've done in dragging greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere or stopping them being from emitted isn't just undone by someone down the road doing something else. Or if you claim a carbon credit unit this year, you've dragged it out of the atmosphere, how do we stop you from just releasing it all again next year? When you go to deal with your unfinancial hotel, it escapes into your carbon project and it all goes up in smoke again. These are the three key elements. The emissions reduction fund is currently $2.5 billion, I think. So it's a reasonable amount of money. It's a market you might want to be interested in. If you're not interested in $2.5 billion of the Australian government's money, then that's your financial decision to make. I'm not here to push you one way or the other. There are definitely people around the room that will be doing that and trying to encourage you to participate in the carbon market, but it really is your decision. The beautiful thing about this is it is voluntary. No one is forcing you to generate a carbon credit. So there's two different types. I've talked about dragging the gases out of the atmosphere and storing them. They're the most common ones around here, so soil carbon or vegetation. Storing them in vegetation. Vegetation's a great place to store carbon. Soil's better. It's much harder to lose it. It gives you a hell of a lot of other benefits, but it's harder to do as well. Then you've got emissions avoidance. These are my favourites. I'm more an instant gratification type of a guy. Carbon sequestration takes a fair while to do, and you've got to keep it there for either 25 or 100 years. I don't have that sort of concentration span, so I like reduced emissions. And so that's where you actually just stop producing them. You can do that once and move on. No, like you can't go back in time and make those emissions happen. You've already stopped them from happening. This is what we're trying to do with feral camels. If you shoot a feral camel, believe it or not, it stops emitting. It's a great idea, I reckon. But there are some complexities in it which we totally underestimated, so that's not going to happen. But you can still do it with livestock. You don't have to shoot them. You can't actually do it by killing livestock, because you were going to do that anyway. But you can do it by changing the way they behave, and I'll be talking about that, I think, after morning tea. It's my favourite. But savanna burning gets a lot of news. That's a good emissions reduction one. And so by changing the type of fire that they have in the top end, because they have pretty much annual burns and they have pretty much annual rainfall, they can change the timing of their fires and change the profile of the gases that those fires release. And so by managing their fire better, they're releasing less gases, so that's avoided emissions. You can pay for your land management. But also there's things, I don't know whether people have heard around piggeries, particularly, but dairy farms as well. The manure ponds, you can cover them, you can stop them from emitting methane, and fertiliser. I don't think there'd be anyone around here using fertiliser too much. We'll touch on later on. I should just check. So get people to put their hands up that are beef producers, if they could, a little bit. I tend to relate back to cattle a lot, but sheep. Yeah, kangaroos don't emit that much. Everyone asks it, but they're pretty efficient animals, so they just don't emit a lot. You want to go for, you really want to go for the easy kill, so to speak. Like the big emitters that we know how to manage, basically. But because these greenhouse gases, you can't, it's not like a house brick. It's not like a cow. You can't count them as you put them on a truck. So how do we know that you've actually stopped a tonne of methane going into the atmosphere? Or how do we know that you've dragged a tonne of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stored it? It's really quite complicated. It's not like our other agricultural products where there's something concrete at the end of the day that you can say, yeah, look, I've got a field bin full of grain here. I know I've just produced 20 tonnes of grain. I know what it's worth. I know what it's cost me. So there's a whole heap of rules around it. And what they actually do is they have a thing called methods. And a method is, it's like the recipe. It's the rule book. So what we do is we say, well, okay, I'm going to do a carbon project. Here's the method I have to follow. Here's the recipe I have to follow. And the Australian government's going to sit there and go, okay, if you follow this recipe, we know that you've made a cake. We don't have to see the cake. We know that if you put eggs in and if you mix it this way and you use milk and sugar, you're going to make a cake. It's the same as this. The method says, if you don't knock down the trees, they're not really worried about it because they don't believe it actually means anything. They don't actually think there's a government policy that's going to impact on them in 20 years, let alone 100 years. But it's a critical point. You're not going to get paid for something if you can't demonstrate that it's going to be there, and you are responsible for it. You do have to do it. There are mechanisms within the legislation to hunt you down, chase you, if you don't do it. If you don't make sure that carbon stays there, you are responsible. It's like forward selling any product, whether it's cattle or grain. You do a forward sales contract. If you don't actually produce that product at the time that your contract says, you have to find a way to meet that contract. You either pay your way out of the contract, or you go into the market and find the product and buy it to meet your contract requirement. It's the same with this. So it is a requirement. You need to maintain the carbon or hand back the credits or make good, like I was just talking about. And this is really important after a fire or a drought. So you do have to re-establish those carbon stocks. You can't just sit there and go, no, there was a fire, I can have anything to do with that, it's not my problem. It doesn't matter, you've sold the product, you need to re-establish it. There'll be all sorts of stuff around trading, because you might be able to sell an Australian carbon credit unit now for, I don't know, $13, and in 2 years' time you might be able to buy them for $5. So you might actually buy them and retire a project or something. But in general, we think the price is going to continue going up. So that would be an interesting position to be in. But it'll be like all the markets. You watch all the agricultural markets now, and people are selling grain futures and all sorts of things. It'll all develop. There is a risk of reversal buffer, but this doesn't cover you guys. This covers the Australian government. So what they do is, if you sequester 100 tonnes of CO2 equivalent into the forest on your land, you generate 100 Australian carbon credit units. The Australian government will give you 95, and they will keep 5 of them and insure the nation. So if there's a drought in southwestern Queensland, the Australian government still needs to look after our entire emissions framework, and they will say, okay, we've got this 5% here which will cover us for the loss that drought has caused at the moment. And it increases. So I think for the 25, if you go for a 25-year permanent rule, that discount is 25%. And that's probably why the majority of landholders have gone for a 100-year permanent rule so far, because they'd rather have a 95% of the cash at the moment rather than a reduced amount. And the carbon obligation runs with the land, so that's why you need permission from the landowner, because it's tied, it's a geographic area, you need to provide the coordinates of it, it sits there with that land, it's tied to it quite clearly. So you can't, the permanence obligation is quite important. It means that the Australian government, the world, us as a society that are paying for these things, can be guaranteed that what we're paying for is real and will stay there. Is that clear? It used to be a really big stumbling block, but I think a lot of people have moved on now. As we've got a bit more policy certainty, we've got a bit more price certainty, then that permanence thing, people are finding it a bit easier to deal with. So this is how carbon credits are traded. So we've talked about you have the right to generate a carbon credit. We've talked about how you can sequester it or emit it, or stop it from being emitted. We've talked about what an Australian carbon credit unit is. So there's a product there. You know how you can create it. So how do you sell it? Under the old system, we had a carbon market where people that were emitting lots and lots could come and buy them from you. Under the new system, we at the moment have effectively one buyer, which is the Australian government. So you can now produce that product, the Australian carbon credit unit, and you go to the Australian government and say, have I got a deal for you? But the Australian government is pretty wise on how they spend their money sometimes, and what they want to do is they want to get the cheapest abatement possible. So they've designed a system where you have to bid into an auction. So you write on the back of your beer coaster how many credits I've got, how much money I want for them, and you submit them in a sealed bid to the Australian government. All at once, everyone does it. The auction opens up, it's open for 2 days, you get on the website and do it. And then the Australian government sits there and goes, okay, we've got $1 billion to spend. how much are we going to buy? And they'll start at the cheapest and work their way up. They'll make some decisions based around whether they think they're getting good value for money, whether they think there's going to be more or less credits available in the future or now, how they need the market to respond, and they will decide where they're going to stop buying credits. They'll just get up to a point where they've said, yeah, okay, that's our budget for this auction. We can look at how the bids are panning out, because you'll end up with, like we looked at that normal distribution curve, you'll end up with a whole heap of bids around a particular price. There'll be some that are way out here as very expensive, there'll be some down here that are really cheap, and they'll make a judgment call along there about where they think they're going to get value for money. So you don't know how many credits are being bid into the auction, you don't know what the price is going to be, the price that you're going to get paid, you don't know who your competition is. Well, you can find out who your competition is, but you don't know how much. So it's a complex way for you guys to become informed sellers. It's not like you can go to a whole heap of stock sales or look at the Eastern Market Index or anything and say, well, righto, this is what the market's doing at the moment, I'm going to sell my cows now. The timing is set by the Australian government, and you don't really know what those are. So at the moment, all they publish as a result, there's been 2 auctions so far, all they publish as a result is how many contracts, how many credits they've bought, and the average price. And from a business perspective, the average price is not particularly useful, because we all know the average price for an agricultural product has little to do with what you might actually see for yours. And so the idea of this is, rather than you looking at how much they're paying and trying to bid into there, you need to look at how much is it costing me to produce it and how much of a profit do I need for it to be worthwhile. But obviously if you bid into the first auction and you don't get selected, you're going to be sitting there going, wow, I've got this cupboard full of acus, what am I going to do with it? And you might go into the next auction and bid in lower because you really want to offload them. Or it could be like people that have really good grain storage at home. They might sit there and go, no, I don't like what the price is doing at the moment. I'm going to sit on them for a while. No one's going to force you to sell your acu. You can generate an acu and not sell it. You can store it just like grain in a silo. But the reverse auction is the way at the moment. Now what will happen is there will be other people in the field looking to buy carbon credits. There's a very small secondary market, they call it at the moment, but there will be people there looking for carbon credit units. And that will build over time. And I don't know, who knows, maybe we'll go back to having a carbon market one day, which is where we were heading to before. Yep.
Why do we need a broker then? We can just bid into the auction.
Theoretically, you don't need a broker at all. So the system is supposed to be designed so you as a landholder can go in, it's very easy to register. You can pick your method, you can register a project, you can do it all yourself. And then you can bid into the auction yourself. Why people are using brokers is because the complexity of the system makes it a bit harder. And so if you look at the auction results, you can go onto the website, there's registers of registered projects, there's also then registers of how many carbon credit units they've generated, and also those with contracts from the auction. And you can have a look at those, and you'll see that there are some there that are individual landholders who have put it forward, but there's a whole slab that have come through brokers because they've spent a lot of time trying to do the economics around where they think the price is going to end up. And it's like in agriculture, you know, there are some landholders that will go from the very basics by selecting the genetics that they want in their stock, all the way through to production, all the way through to sales on farm, or through to slaughter, and then they take it down to a restaurant in Brisbane and market it as a particular product. So there's some people that want to be involved all the way through that production chain, but there are some people that will sit there and go, well look, I've got land here, I'm just going to adjust stock. And so they're really narrowing that part of the production chain they want to be involved in. It's the same with carbon. So there will be some people that will really want to get involved in all detail and maximise the profit they're going to get. But there'll be others that are saying, no, I'm comfortable with this part of it, the land management part, I'm just going to pay someone to do these other bits for me. So the only person, I don't know, who's got solar panels on their roof? When you bought those solar panels, did you tick a little box on the bottom of the form that meant that you got the panels a little bit cheaper and you transferred the right to the renewable energy credits to someone else? Or did you keep the renewable energy credits and go into the market and sell them? Most people don't even know you've got that choice. But there is a landholder. There was a lady at a workshop in Dubbo in New South Wales, and she introduced herself as, I'm just a farmer's wife. And then when we were talking, I said, so does anyone do this? And she went, yeah, I did that. I was like, no, I mean the little box at the bottom of the form, yeah, not that you've just bought solar panels, everyone's done that. No, I did that. And then you can go onto the website and have a look at what a renewable energy credit's worth, and you can just sell them. And I said, really? When did you do that? Why did you do that? She said, well, I was looking at it one day and I read that thing at the bottom of the form and I thought, what does that mean? And so she got on there and had a look and she saw what they were worth, and then she saw what she was effectively being offered as a discount by the company and went, look at that, I can do that. So she was right into it. She's generating a renewable energy credit and trading it. We didn't even do that. When we put solar panels on our house, you tick the box and move on. It wasn't worth the pain and the heartache and all that sort of stuff. So it's your decision as to whether you use a broker or not, but you can definitely go it alone. At the end of this, all these people with no eyes, these faceless men over here become people with no eyes, and then everyone's smiling because everyone makes money. The Australian government, it buys carbon credit units at the lowest possible cost, and the seller, he gets profit if he's made the game right, or she, and also gets to sell their product. They're not left with a cupboard full of accus that they're sitting there going, gee, what are my kids going to do with this? This is old data. This is from November 2014, and this is at the point where the Australian government had issued 10 million accus, 10 million Australian carbon credit units. So the light blue in these pie charts for each of the states and territories is waste, landfills. So if you've got a big government council tip, they rot and everything, the methane goes to the atmosphere. What you do is you put a big cover over it and you trap those gases and stop them from going into the atmosphere. You flare them off, you can generate a carbon credit. So we can see very early on in Australian carbon land, the majority of the credits, 65% or close to, came from waste management. So although we called it the Carbon Farming Initiative, it was more your Carbon Council Rubbish Dump Initiative. That's all right, those guys were ready to go. That was technology that was really proven. We had methods in place. They could hit the ground running. The interesting one here is then where the next part came in. So you can see vegetation here in Western New South Wales is at 60%. You can see there's a little bit in WA, there was a little bit in the Northern Territory, but it's pretty much all here. That was people that had land clearance credits in Western New South Wales that didn't use them. So their change, their additionality, their beyond business as usual was that they stopped clearing. So you can see it's a large slice of what was going on in Western New South Wales. It's about a third of the carbon credits that were generated in Australia. So this is by November 2014, 12 months ago. Then you can see these ones up here around Savannah burning. So effectively, you had the Australian rangelands providing about 40% of Australia's carbon credit units. Is that 1 hour? Yeah? That's good. Where we get, so you can see that the rangelands is actually carrying the can for a fair bit of the country once you take out the landfill waste. Now that we've had changes, and under the new system, this is a summary, Paul will talk about the auction results later, so I'm just tapping on them here to show you what it means for the land sector, what it means for agriculture. You guys are the land sector. So at the end of the first auction, this was the result. So you can still see, so this was 12 months later. Sequestration is starting to take the lead. So the landfill waste ones, that sort of reached their peak in the auction result. Sequestration, this is still rangelands-based vegetation, Western New South Wales particularly, but also into southwest Queensland. You can see these other things are there, but they're really quite small in comparison. but they're coming. The transport stuff didn't rate a mention on that first graph, and that was only 12 months ago. So the second option, it's different again, and further speakers will talk about that. But it shows that the rangelands, like this isn't some mythical beast, this is actually real for you guys in the landscape right now. In southwestern Queensland at the moment, you've got 69 my little disclaimer, again being a consultant, this may not be true. I was tired. It's a complex spreadsheet. I was just going through, and I don't actually know all your local government areas or as well as you guys will. But you can go onto the website and you can go through this and you can see not only which local government area the projects are in, but what the name of it is, which is generally a property or a landholder name, or the parish numbers and all that sort of stuff. So you can see where these projects are. But at the moment you've got 69 projects registered, you've got 43 contracts awarded in the 2 auctions that have been held so far, and I just did a rough count. You've got 8 projects that I could find that have generated 340,000 Australian carbon credit units. That's in southwest Queensland now. So the next auction's in April next year. So this will go up, particularly if the people that have come through our Carbon Expo part of it have anything to do with it. They will be looking to actually generate carbon projects. Because 340,000 carbon credit units, that's the tip of the iceberg for you guys. Remember that those first pie chart ones, that was when we reached 10 million. We're now up to about 19 million Australian carbon credit units generated in Australia. I don't know, about 540 odd projects. So there's 340,000. Sounds like a lot. It's a lot for southwest Queensland, but it's not a massive amount compared to what the potential is. The last bit I just want to touch on, because it's obviously been in the news a fair bit and is fairly current, is the Paris COP. Most people started paying attention to COPs when they went to Copenhagen, which seems like it was yesterday, but I think it was about 2009. I keep looking down here because Paul knows everything. I'm not. He doesn't make it up like I do. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. So it's just where the world comes together and says, right, what are we going to do about this, if anything? And everyone was really hoping for them to come together in Copenhagen and say, right, we're going to do something. It's going to be really important. It was a great time to invest in renewable energy shares if you wanted to lose your money. It was a great time for world protests and everyone to think that the world was going to change, and not much happened. They came out of Copenhagen and didn't do much at all. We then went to Durban. I think we might have had 2 more since then. Anyway, we did reach an agreement at the previous one. The world reached an agreement that said, righto, we're all going to get together and reach an agreement. That was as far as they got. We know we need to do something beyond Kyoto, but okay, we're all in this. We're all in the same boat. We will actually try and reach an agreement. So then they've just had the Paris COP, the last one, which finished a couple of days ago, and they actually managed to reach an agreement. Now these things are critical for you guys, believe it or not. Paris is not just about fashion. And the reason these are critical for you is based on these squiggly lines here. These things are called relative concentration pathways. And we say that the world, we need to keep global warming below 2 degrees. Otherwise things are going to go pear-shaped really badly instead of just a little bit. And they've got different pathways. So they've got from 2.6 to 4.5, I think it's 6.4 or something, and then 8.5. And what that means is, if we keep emitting as we are, what will happen? If we keep emitting but we change, maybe we peak in about 2080 or something and then we drop off with our emissions, where will that get us? Or if we stop emitting now, we reach peak emissions now, where will that get us? So that's the concentration pathway. They're relative to each other and they'll give us different end results. So most people have written off RCP 2.6 because it basically says we all would have got our act together years ago and we would have reached peak emissions before 2020, I think, or pretty much now. That's not going to happen, but again, that's just my opinion. where they got to in Paris is they said, well, we think this 4.5 thing might be doable. So we still need to aim to keep things below 2 degrees, and we're going to aim for 1.5. Well, 2 degrees or better, they said, so people, and 1.5 gets a mention, which is a massive, massive undertaking. We're nowhere near it at the moment. This graph here shows you the nice little temperature differences that we might get. So you look down and you're looking at, if we go with a relative concentration pathway of 8.5, then some parts of the planet will be well and truly beyond livable. Well, most of the planet will be, really. You're looking at temperature increases in the range of sort of 4 to 10 degrees or something. If we stick to the lowest one, which we're not going to, that gets you to 0.5 to 1 degree change. So we can live with that now, but that's where we're at in Australia now. If we can keep it below 2 degrees, it's going to be a pretty different planet to what we're used to, and your kids will be doing very different things to what we're doing. But it should still be livable at least. Now, if you've got kids, you need to pay attention to this. If you don't, well, you've just got to worry about your lifetime. The Paris Agreement is critical because at the moment, all 195 countries actually reached that agreement. If you look at the emissions reductions they've pledged to, we're still not going to hit the targets they're talking about. We'll still be up closer to 3 degrees. So we'll be up somewhere on this graph around here. And so what that means is all those global targets, those countries have agreed to reach for, they need to increase them. So over time, we've recognised that we need to increase our targets. Again, this is old data. This is from earlier this year. This is a mob called the Climate Change Authority who were making recommendations on what Australia's current target should be. So we went to the Paris meeting and said, righto, we think we're going to reduce our emissions by 26 to 28%, below 2005 levels by 2030. I mentioned earlier that 2005 was an important date because it's when we peaked. So you pick 2005 because it sounds great. We're going to reduce by 30%. But 30% below 2005 levels is worth nowhere near as much as 30% below 1995 levels where our emissions were really low. But it still sounds like we're doing heaps. And it's fair enough, like there's all sorts of international politics in this, and country, the size of the target that they announce dictates the size of the market. So if they say we've got a target of a 50% reduction by 2030, then that means we either need to store a hell of a lot more in our trees and soils or in other methods, industrial methods, or we need to stop emitting a lot more. Either way, it means the demand for an Australian carbon credit unit increases. And if you guys are in the position to generate a carbon credit unit, the demand for your product increases. Now, to make the differences that they've agreed to in Paris, we're going to have to do more than that. There will be significant change in policy and how we approach things. But it still shows that this stuff is going to be around for a long time. So they agreed that there'd be a global stock take in 2023, and then we would have 5 yearly reviews. And the expectation is that nations will increase their targets at those 5 yearly reviews. And what will happen is that we'll actually see a coming together of all these national schemes, like we have a scheme here, New Zealand has one, everyone has one, China has a number of them, but they'll soon just have one. So we'll see a coming together of all those schemes, so there'll be more interaction internationally. So at the moment, your buyer is the Australian government through a reverse auction, but it will become like all other products, where your buyer and the prices you're getting will be dependent on what's happening internationally as well. So instead of watching Landline, or as you're watching Landline and watching the corn yield index or something in California or Canada or wherever, you'll also see something around carbon pricing and what's happening in different parts of the world. So it shows that our commitment to this goes well beyond our current policy and program environment. I think I've covered most of that, which means I have finished in time for questions. I'm finishing early, Anyone got any questions about any of that or anything?
Reducing emission.
Yep.
So I'm a grazier out there, and I've got 2,000 head of cattle. And so I'm going to sell them to the abattoir so they get killed. And I'm not going to put any cattle on my place for 2 years because I think we're going into a 2-year drought. Can I sell the non-production of that methane for 2 years? Is that?
Just let me have a drink. In short, no.
So what's the difference between that and the camel thing you're trying to do? 'Cause, you know,
Camels, thank you. You've started me. Wahoo! I get my soapbox back. No, the thing about cattle production is you're producing those cows with the sole intention of killing them. Now, I won't tell Peter if you don't, but I know that's what you want to do. The Australian government knows that's what you want to do. If you don't produce those cows, we have a global market for protein, someone else will. And so the change that our global atmosphere actually sees isn't impacted. So you can't sell the credit from destocking domestic stock. Apart from that, we don't want to create a system where we all starve to death. There's no point in having a great atmosphere and no food. And so the Australian government doesn't actually want to provide perverse outcomes so people can go in and go, oh, look what the price of carbon's done. Geez, that shit's all over beef. I'm going to dump my cows. It was, sorry?
I've got a couple of questions. You said if this is an agricultural product, why is the government taxing us as a off-farm income?
Yeah, so I said you need to...
Use one hand and taking it out.
Yeah, it's a different business. We will touch on that this afternoon. Yeah, and that's a great... I love those parts of the discussion. The one in Cobar the other day was the first time in my life I've been in a room with a heap of pastoralists and people were talking about a tax problem. That's great. But yeah, it's a key point. So when I say it's just another agricultural product, I'm trying to get you to frame your thinking about whether you can engage in this market or not. So it's treated as a financial product. They're traded like stocks and that sort of stuff. But the way you generate it is like you manipulate your landscape, you look at what your soil potential is, you look at what your vegetation potential is, you look at what your grazing industry or your cropping industry practices are like.
Another thing, with the methods that the government has, and I've seen the maps that they use, and they're really old maps, so they're working with old maps. Why are they not getting new, up-to-date maps that they're working with?
It depends on the method.
It has a big impact on our country. You know, the growth of the trees.
Yeah. So some of the methods use a model, so they don't go out and actually dig up the tree and weigh it and work out how much carbon is in it. They use a model. But because it's modelled, we need to be really sure that it's there. We need to make sure that we're buying what we've said is there. And so the models will be quite conservative. So a direct management method will generally give you a greater number of credits, but it costs more to do. Whereas a modelled method, we're saying, yeah, we think it's going to produce 100, but we want to be really, really sure, so we'll discount it a bit because it's modelled rather than directly measured.
John.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
sorry.
think, is there one more?
One last question, this might be a stupid question. The Gillard government bought the carbon credits in, didn't they? They bought,
Yep.
so they
Permits or an Australian carbon credit. And what they were trying to do is lead us to a carbon market. So those guys, the big emitters, they could either buy a permit from the Australian government or buy an Australian carbon credit unit if they didn't want to do those other things. And it was really simple. They could sit there, say you're running a power station, they could sit there and go, right, it's going to cost me $100 million to stick a widget in the side of my machine and it's going to make it more efficient. Is that $100 million going to be cheaper than the number of permits I need to buy? And the permit price was that $23 and it went up in steps. The permits that they bought, that money went to the Australian government, and the Australian government used that money to give pensioners an increase, to give us tax rebates because they were worried that we'll all be ruined because of the carbon price. And so that's where all the benefit came from. They also ran the system. They also created a thing called it was so long ago, I think it was the Biodiversity Fund, and paid for land management outcomes. So, environmental outcomes. So that's what they did with the permit money. It was a cost-neutral system, was supposed to be. So that's sort of not sitting there. What happened when the new government came in? They said, righto, those big emitters don't need to do that anymore. They're not going to be buying carbon credit units. They don't need to buy permits. The Australian government's going to buy them all. They thought it was a weird thing. You had the Labor Party espousing free market economics, and you've got the Liberal Party espousing centralised government purchase. But they said, no, they don't need to do that anymore. The Australian government's going to take it. We're all still paying for it. They're just paying for it in taxes now rather than when you turn a light switch on. But they're going to take that tax money and they're going to buy the credits because they believe it's a cheaper way to get the abatement. Does that make sense? So there's there's none of that billion sitting around. They spent it as they went.
They just buy those credits, those ACCU.
Yep.
And they just sit them there. They don't sell them on.
They staple them, sit them in the filing cabinet and say Australia is meeting its emissions targets. They're not making a profit out of it. I've got 5 minutes.
As an example, if you have a project on, say, 5,000 hectares of mulga and it burns down, what's the financial impact on the landholder of that contract?
That's a really big question. So it depends on whether you've sold them, how much you sold them for, and how you're going to make good. This is the Australian rangelands, everyone. This is increasing carbon stored in vegetation over time. So you've got tonnes of CO2 emitted and you've got time. In the Australian rangelands, generally, things are pretty slow to move. Somewhere between the 5, 15 to 25 year mark, depending on your soils and rainfall and stuff, is where you get your mass increase, and then it starts to plateau out. And in some areas it actually drops back down again as the system becomes less efficient. So some of that country around Western New South Wales and stuff, some of that country can be challenging in the long term. What happens if you have a fire, say, you've generated carbon credits, say you've generated 100 tonnes at that point, you have a fire, you wipe out some of your carbon credits, you've got 25 there, so you've lost your minus 75 ACCUs. You then need to start building that up again until you get back to that level. So the financial impact could be in a number of ways. If you've generated the credits but you haven't sold them, the financial impact is that you need to spend the money, do whatever it is that you're doing to rebuild your carbon stocks. If you've generated the credits but you have sold them, then you need to make good in here. So you have the opportunity to just grow them back, but you can't get an income source while you're doing that. You can't sell more until you're back up to the level that you're at. Or you could potentially go into the market. You might have sold these things for $24 a tonne, and now you can go in and buy them from someone for $10 a tonne. So you could just go back into the market and buy them and get yourself back out of trouble. There'll also be all sorts of things like insurance policies and all sorts of things will develop over time. But the financial impact is really up to how you've structured your business and how you've treated those credits. I think I've got time for one more.
You just, John, John, if you can comment, like just the change in the way beef cattle are being assessed as 25% less methane than they previously thought to emit. Does that change those graphs, and does it change the herd management methodology?
I love Peter for that question. What he's referring to is a CSIRO report that was released yesterday. I haven't looked at it in depth, but what it should do, I'll talk about the beef meth after smoko, and I'll touch on that then if that's all right. I'll talk about the specifics of what it means when we look at the different animals and different herds, basically. So is that it? Oh no, one more. Sorry, there was another one over the back there somewhere, but I might have got sick of it.
If not, I'll go. There's one.
But just following on from what you were just doing here, like if you were selling those accus as being produced,
Yep.
and then you had a fire wipe it out, like you're saying you've got to either regenerate it or you've got to pay for it. Like
Yep.
in our marginal rainfalls, regenerate mulga, only thing that's going to regenerate mulga is a big wet year, probably 2 or 3 or 4.
Yeah, so you've got that time frame. So depending on how far that fire brings you back down this graph, so here's your peak production period. You've got a bit of a functioning ecosystem, the seed's there, the plants are small, they'll boom, you turn around, you go away on holidays and you come back and your paddock's full of them. But it takes them a while to get there. And so if that fire brings you back into this bit where your growth and your build-up is really slow at the start, it's going to take you a hell of a lot longer to build it back up. But if the fire only takes out half the product here, then it won't take you as long to build it up. The other thing you could do, which, again, nothing I say should be construed as financial advice or should be quoted in any way like I know what I'm talking about, but the other thing you could do is actually have a project that generates 1,000 carbon credit units and you only sell 500 of them. And so it's like if you do a forward contract for grain particularly, but also for stock, if you think you're going to grow 100 tonnes of grain, you don't forward contract, well maybe you do forward contract 100 tonnes of grain, I don't know, but a lot of people will forward contract a lesser amount. So they're sort of self-insuring for any loss or anything. So if you've done that, you're covered. You've got 100 credits, but you've only sold 50. You've lost 50 in the fire, so you have no liability that you have to meet. So you've got all the time in the world to actually rebuild that. So there's all sorts of different ways you can handle that. But it is, I personally, the carbon project developers over smoko, have a chat with them, but personally I reckon fire is the biggest risk you've got, and boredom. I'd get bored with a veg project pretty quickly. But fire is probably the largest risk you've got. No offence to you guys that deal with veg projects. They won't get bored, they're making $1 million. Why I wouldn't get bored, I'd go on holidays.
It's a change of government. Tony, you've got a bit of
the policy. So I used to do these presentations, say we've got 3 big things: price, so if you can deal with the politics and the permanent stuff, you can manage price. You do it already. So when you talk about permanence, the option stuff is actually dealt with permanence. People are going for 100 years. So the permanent stuff people are actually getting more comfortable with. So it comes down to the politics. And I really wish I should have included this slide. I'll put it in at the end. Because really the politics is going to change. It always does. Beef, as the live export debacle showed, is no security. You get a program, whether it be state, Australian or local government policy or program change, and it impacts on your business every day. What we've seen through the COP and what we've seen through our long-term targets and what's happening internationally is, regardless of what our short-term domestic policy is going to be, this stuff is around to stay. How you can sell it, how you can generate it, how the mechanisms will work, absolutely they're going to change. But the product itself and what we need to do as a globe is, in my opinion, here to stay. And even if it's not, remember I said you guys have got, you're in front of the starting gun at the moment. The rest of the industries and all the rest of the country is sitting there waiting for the gun to go off, or the gun's gone off and they just haven't heard it, then you guys have got the chance now. So even if it is going to be short term, why wouldn't you jump on it? Take the opportunity while you can. Because at the moment you're not actually being penalised for anything that you produce. You've actually just got the opportunity to participate in the market. But I come up on it very clearly, because I'm very risk averse, believe it or not.